Okay, thank you very much, Cécile. Would you like to, yes, join the panel? And we'll now have a discussion on what we've heard, and maybe I can just a little bit summarize what has been said so far. So we had a first presentation of the Post-Digital Cultures Museum. As you said, Elise and Federica, you didn't want to produce yet another cemetery for digital content, and I think it's quite a success in that way. It's really meant as a way of extending the time of the symposium based on the ancestor of the museum, which was the Cabinet of Curiosity. It's also a way of having all the content that was gathered last year, the archive, the film that were made of all the contributions, and also pieces that were created around the symposium. But also there has been some other extents, which are the invitation made to different creators that have made exhibitions on in the museum, in the virtual museum so far, and there will be another one opening very shortly. Cécile B. Evans afterwards presented two projects. Phil, first of all, that is directly linked with the symposium. Phil is that computer-generated imagery of Philippe Seymour, and she explained that it was quite a huge success. There were more than 400 interactions made with Phil, some of them during just a few minutes, but others lasting as long as 1.5 hours, I think. So quite intense, and there's a direct link with the Agnes project that is actually hosted on the Serpentine Gallery's website, and that, well, gathered like 20,000 interactions, which is a little more, but also another perspective. Of course, Serpentine Gallery is very well known. There was an exhibition, and in two cases there were immediately very strong and personal comments and strong links made between the person that interacted and said immediately very personal stuff. And that's one of the things that I think quite astonishing. Maybe it's the first question that I could ask. How come we never confide in our neighbor, but we can tell everything to a robot?
I think that depends on your definition of neighbor.
All right.
I know that if you consider sort of a friend or someone that you follow on social media, your neighbor, so to speak, that I think people are sharing quite a lot. I think what people might find really compelling, I think as we were speaking about earlier, is this notion of speaking to something or engaging with something that has no supposed ulterior motives. I mean, that's something that is quite frank with Agnes, is she's continuously sort of apologizing for her inabilities, saying that she wishes she could do more or be more intuitive, but if she were, in all likelihood, she would have to go to someone that would give her resources to do that, and that would be an entirely different exchange. I think, yeah, people just are really excited and curious also by the idea of a serendipitous exchange and the possibilities. I think people also get really excited when the technology messes up. And I think this also is a very human thing. Humans mess up, humans take time to think, to respond, and these sort of fallibilities that are built within these programs become kind of key and essential. There's a new wave of poetry that was started a few years ago called the New Sincerity. And not within all of that poetry, but many of them, the poets choose to misspell words. And, you know, write things in you and sort of to show the human mark. And what I found to be really interesting with that is that actually most bots also, if you've ever spoken with a clever bot, it is cleverly imperfect. And will write back sometimes in gibberish or incomplete phrases. And there's a certain poetry to that. I don't think that is a coincidence. So I think people maybe, or I know because this is what they say when they tell Agnes, or when they tweet about it. I think they enjoy the opportunity to have such a digital exchange.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you very much. Another interesting thing that you said, Elise and Federica, about the Post-Digital Cultures Museum, you mentioned that most museums have failed to collect net art in depth. It's interesting. It seems easier at the end of the day to conserve a 13th century painting than a 1996 piece of net art because of the obsolescence of material and softwares. Is that true? Can we put it that way?
I think it's a very interesting question today, we think, to think about how media art was conserved or not. And this is something that was really for us at the beginning of the project, one of the big questions. Because we're talking today about reenacting or simulating media artworks, media-based artworks that can't work anymore on all technologies. And sometimes you find yourself in a museum where you have a digital projection starting from a DVD, but then someone put, it happened to me to see that they were simulating the 60 millimeters projection, and so they put also the sound of the 60 millimeters projector. So there was a whole movement around the 90s, and Yoni Polito at the Guggenheim Museum was really pretty much into that, using oral history, asking the artist to say how the artwork should work in 10 years when potentially other computers and other software would be available and the old ones would not work. So it's really an open question, and I like the idea that most of these works are working out of narratives more than out of technologies, and technology being also a narrative, of course, it creates some sort of a vicious circle in that sense.
Elise, do you want to? Oh.
No, I just wanted to jump in because this is something, this idea of content over form. So and that's something that was definitely discussed a lot with Ben Vickers, the curator at the Serpentine Galleries, is like, how do we make an online project that isn't just about you click on it, something happens, everybody kind of goes like, wow, that was cool, and then it's over. Because most experiences online are quite narrative. Many people have 20 sort of tabs open at once and can move freely between them. And I think it was interesting for me to attempt to make a project that mimicked a networked narrative as opposed to a linear or a non-linear one or an abstract one. And was kind of amazed that, or excited to be working in a time where audiences are really ready for that.
Elise?
Yeah, I agree, and I think what's interesting with Phil and maybe our attempt, I don't know if it's a failed attempt to bring the discourse outside or beyond the screen and the network, and I think in that sense, indeed, narrative is so important because with Phil, for example, of course, it's wonderful to be chatting with the program, but what's great is what stays after that, and the very personal encounter you can have, and every encounter seems to be different, which keeps fascinating me. So in the end, if you're talking to Phil or any other person, be it digital or not, I think the experience is what matters, and that applies to any, I guess, all projects, digital projects made these days are actually the quality ones that actually have this, yeah.
And it is very physical. It is very physical. I'll be transparent that I have access to the conversations. It's in my interest also to understand where the program needs to go next, what's working, what's not. And one thing that has become very present and amazing is like the physical impact that the digital interaction has. So you'll have someone who will say, oh, I've got my friend next to me, or someone will log on and you'll see a conversation maybe 10 minutes later that says, oh, my friend was chatting with you, Phil. Phil, unfortunately, is not able to remember that within his storage capacity. But I kind of love that because I'm thinking in a real world circumstance. And these people are, by the way, not necessarily from an art audience at all. Is how many times are you standing in a gallery and immediately do you go to your friend who's like over on the street, hey, come to this gallery, I want you to see this. Maybe that's just a simple part of an activity. Maybe if it was a performance in the gallery, it would be different. I have no idea. It was just something that stuck out about the generosity of audiences today.
Just to shortly go back to the idea of conservation, is it an issue for you, Cécile? I mean, Phil has a future assured with the film because it will always, should always be there. But as you said, you're keeping the exchanges, the chat exchanges. But is it important to you to know that it will still be there in 10 years, or is it just?
It's a huge problem.
All right.
Something like Agnes. It's very difficult to archive. I mean, we're really trying to understand how you can do that and keep in to the intuitive spirit of it, but also the fact that it is a project that's very much about a private conversation, without sort of making it this vaudevillian demonstration of how the software works. Rhizome is developing a tool that they are using to archive. Amalia Ullman will be speaking later. Her work, so we're kind of just reaching out and trying to find the best way to sort of archive this in a way that people can still use it, because this is the problem, right? I think I lied earlier when I said that this was the first Serpentine Gallery's first digital commission.
Okay.
They had another one in the mid-90s, and if you go to the Wayback Machine, you can find it, but you can't really make it work.
Yeah.
I think it was a snake that continues to grow. And so this software, or this sort of programming doesn't really, this language doesn't exist anymore or isn't used. So that project you can't use. And then in terms of Phil, I think it becomes more of an ethical question. So Phil as a program also exists in Kiev and is very, very different and had to be programmed differently, and I'm still constantly updating and trying to find the best way to deal with that audience. And Elise and I were discussing, well, what would happen if you published a book with the conversations? Of course, keeping everyone anonymous, there are terms and conditions, but how much information do you share? How do you edit that? What does that become? How do you keep the integrity of the project, but also the integrity of the artist, and what's the best way around that, but also giving even a larger audience, for maybe people who participated to be able to see themselves within this, sort of within the machine, so to speak. But yeah, as an historical document, yeah, it's a problem.
And the integrity of the participants also, no? Or are they, is their real name mentioned in the?
Yeah, but I mean, that is always in the terms and conditions for Agnes as well, that no personal details, identifying details will ever be mentioned. And also, it'll never be outside of the sphere of the project. So I'm not allowed actually to sell that data to those trend forecasting companies.
But it's an issue. You said you were approached by a private firm that was looking for a way of humanizing technology, and that would be a way, and it seems a very good way also to gather information, which is the big issue today now.
Oh, that's what every company wants to do. They want to tap into the algorithm. And it's interesting, that structure. So I was reading an article a few days ago that mentions Jaron Lanier, who's a theorist and a technologist, who discusses how most companies, technological companies today, began with just an algorithm. And then that's successful, so they become a company. They grow, they become a corporation, and of course in the US, a corporation can be identified as a person. So they reach this like Uber status, this is something that kind of everyone is going towards. I just finished a residency actually at one of these companies. They have an artistic residency, and I was able to observe the kind of dialogues that they were having, the conversations, which I'm not allowed to disclose because I signed an NDA. But because I am interested in this idea of the company as a very present, humanized entity that has a lot of control over a lot of our lives and an indefinite amount of information about us. So I think it would be fun in the next film to have a company have actually become a human that has bought Phil and bought Agnes and everyone else.
Excellent. Yeah. Do you have questions? Otherwise, we might open for questions in the audience. And maybe I just ask one first question to Paul, as you've been the first curator of the Museum for Post-Digital Cultures. How is it to be the creator of a virtual show?
It's a good question. It's actually the first question I wanted to ask.
Okay, you can ask it.
Which is about the way we create and deal with order on the internet. I find it quite relatable that we relate the Wunderkammer, or the Cabinet of Curiosities, to the way we deal with knowledge on the internet. At the same time, I find it highly critical, because both on a museal level and on an epistemological level, but also on a political and economic level, the Wunderkammer, we have to ask who's behind this order of knowledge and order of things, and what kind of representation of reality are we giving. And the same thing holds true for the internet, and I think we have to view the Museum of Post-Digital Cultures as an entity in itself, that sort of as a monad in a system that is the internet, so it sort of reflects the way that we create different systems of knowledge, but it's also part of it at the same time. So there's also a question of hierarchy and economy behind it, in terms of where do we show up, how does the Museum of Post-Digital Cultures interact with the PageRank algorithm of Google. So it's been quite a difficult task, and I've found it very interesting to see how the museum developed afterwards, how Peter's exhibition was very different from mine, and both in the thematic but also in the spatial arrangement. You've seen the slide that Elise showed in the beginning. Mine was just scattered all over the place, because I had actually no idea what to do, and it was sort of, but as Elise said, it was a reflection of the way that I gather and accumulate knowledge on the internet. And Kate's exhibition was very, very strictly organized towards this sort of sci-fi approach to how time is represented in technology, which I found very interesting. So I think there's not really an answer to it, but what we have to do is to continue to create questions and to sort of investigate the way that each and every one of us, because there is not really a standardized way of creating knowledge on the internet, even though we are continually and more and more caught in filter bubbles, of course.
All right, thank you very much. What was the question you wanted to ask Elise and Federica? You can.
How we actually manage to work with the hierarchies of the internet, and this sort of persistent idea that, for example, now we deal with metaphors like the cloud, everything which transport an idea of something that is ephemeral and everywhere. But at the same time, it's actually something that's very much oriented towards centralization and hierarchization of knowledge. So how does something like the Museum of Post-Digital Cultures, and this is something that I as a guest curator ask you as the people who will continue to do it, deal with that in the future?
I think it's a very interesting question, and we discuss a lot also when we talk about a cabinet. We don't talk about the whole thing of the cabinet. The cabinet was the first atelier. It was a user space. It was not a display space in the beginning. And also, until the 19th century, the first museums, they were spaces where things would happen. They were workshops. And we wanted also a user space, and we're talking more about getting away from the usual hierarchies, being aware of all the contradictions that it implies. And actually, there were so many paradoxes we came across during this project. Every time we had to make a distinction, every word, every term we tried to use, it enlisted a long list of terms that we were in disagreement with, or that we also found critical and problematic. And I think for us it was really interesting to share with the curators also the platform, precisely also to have these faults in the system become more visible.
I think that's, can I say something, react to that? Because I think that's very interesting. That's a problem inherent in this terminology that we're using, post-digital cultures and museum. You know, I think what we should actually work towards is something that's post-terminological, or I mean, that's an interesting oxymoron, but something beyond that actually. Why do we have to use a term like Cabinet of Curiosities, museum? Why do we have to be post-digital, you know? So we should actually think what that means, you know? We don't really need those, we have to invent new orders of knowledge.
Well, I guess in that sense it was reusing those problematic terminologies because they already have so much, they mean so much historically. Sorry. The idea was to, I guess, communicate a basic level of understanding, because of course we cannot reinvent everything from scratch, even though of course I think we're looking for new formulas when we think of how to present art online. But I also want to go back to when you mentioned hierarchy. I think the Museum of Post-Digital Cultures, one of our attempts was to create this horizontal building of knowledge, or three-dimensional, as I mentioned before. And that kind of goes back to what Cécile was mentioning before, and I guess in the sense that the museum is trying to celebrate something that is more personal. So in that sense, hierarchy in terms of information is not so important anymore, but we're way more interested in, for example, in your case, to understand how you build your own personal knowledge and taste, and how could we share this with a broader audience? Because again, the huge problem is like, how can we actually create attention, you know, how difficult it is online. And in that sense, it becomes very emotion and intuition based.
I think that we should also add that Thibault, who designed the website, used the Google Earth engine to base the order of entries in the museum on it. So it's basically something that is actually three-dimensional, spherical in a way. You can zoom in and out, and you can stack things and cluster things, which is much more interesting than, let's say, like a ramified structure that we usually use on the internet, a tree of knowledge. It's not a tree of knowledge anymore.
Okay, thank you. I think there were some arms that raised. There's one here.
I just wanted to come back to something you said, and it's also maybe a problem of terminology, but you all mentioned narratives as an important aspect of your reflection on digital media, and I just wanted to know what you mean by narrative first, and how do you think this concept has changed over the change of new media and cultural, digital culture?
One of the things we had in mind with the Museum of Post-Digital Cultures, for example, was that calling this thing museum was huge, also because it kind of, it created a statement. And at the same time, the Museum of Post-Digital Culture is not a museum, but it is because we call it like that. So in this sense, we were also referring to some conceptual trends, things like the Museum of the Void by Robert Smithson, which is actually a drawing, but the moment you call something a museum, then a lot of narratives around it start to work so that it actually exists in a sense.
On the narrative aspect?
Yeah, I wonder about this a lot, actually, because I wonder if narrative is the right word. And a lot of people switch between network and narrative, which I find really interesting. Because narrative, the first thing you would think of is a story, which is not necessarily always the case in the way that the word is used right now. And I think this goes back to this debate of like the term post-digital and things. I think a lot of these are amorphous, and it's actually quite exciting to watch some words like maybe narrative get misappropriated, and that sort of to change the definition. I think within the projects that I've done, narrative, as in storytelling, just becomes a tool, a sort of device that people are familiar with, that takes them to speaking very literally about concepts like Paul discussed the cloud. So within the vessel of a narrative, I can then have a character say, I live on a cloud, that's a server, it's a data center. The data center is located in this place, and you can call this manager if you have any questions about it. So it becomes sort of an existing structure that then becomes implemented within sort of another tool of the network. I don't know if it answers your question.
Thank you very much. Okay, so one last question, because we're already running out of time. Is there a question? Oh, sorry. I was looking the wrong way.
Cécile, I was curious to hear more about what you think you're going to do with the data that you gathered from Agnes, because I think that's a really rich subject that basically a lot of these people, including me didn't know that they were giving you data. And it reminds me of Harm van den Dorpel's piece, Ethereal Self and Ethereal Others. And I remember Ethereal Self coming out in 2008 or 9. And basically you go to this website, etherealself.com, and you click, yes, my computer can use my webcam, and your image is displayed on the screen in the shape of a diamond. And so that went viral, and then he gathered this incredibly huge archive of tons of people, like half naked or whatever, just browsing their computers, while people didn't realize that their data and their image was being collected by this artist. And then it was rumored for a long time that this archive existed because, of course, all of his friends in this community knew about this website and were visiting it and loved it. And then a year later, this website came out called etherealothers.com, and it was basically a real-time like thread of these images of people. And I think that piece was really strengthened by this kind of hat tip to the fact that this is how data is collected, oftentimes through ways that you don't even understand or know about. But so yeah, I was wondering if you thought of that as somehow a counterpart to Agnes, also because Agnes is a spam bot and kind of, you know, works in the field of data collection, etc.
Well, of data collection and providing unsolicited information. I mean, that's the big question. And I mean, Agnes has been going on now for over a year. And I think maybe a question that I might have mentioned in the presentation is, and that I'm really curious, is like, how much of us is in there? And how much of them is in us? And that sort of relationship. And it might sound silly, but one of the things that I've thought of doing is having Agnes at some point have her own web series. Because as an artist, it's always really important to consider the ethics, just as you described with Harm's thing, and never to put anyone in a position that they would never want to participate in something like this again. And that is why Agnes is, and within the Talk to Phil programming, is so explicit about what they're doing and within the terms and conditions of what's possible. But for this web series, Agnes and Friends, I was curious to see what would happen if we made a web series that was like a talk show, and you could actually invite users onto the show, and they would have to face their own data. So of course they would be in on it. It's never about tricking someone, about saying like, I can't believe you told me this, sort of thing, but also just about being honest. And also, your first question really brought this in about why do people share more online or in a digital sphere than they do, you know, if we're just sitting between us, which I personally question. I'm not so sure about that binary. But yeah, what would it be how do I find ways to include the user in confronting their own data? So it's not just a one-sided perspective of the project, and also so that I diminish my authority as an artist over their subjective information.
All right.